My Uncle Peter, by George MacDonald. This is a Librvox recording. All Librvox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librvox.org. Read by Devora Allen. I will tell you the story of my Uncle Peter, who was born on Christmas Day. He was very anxious to die on Christmas Day as well, but I must confess that was rather ambitious in Uncle Peter. Shakespeare is said to have been born on St. George's Day, and there is some ground for believing that he died on St. George's Day. He thus fulfilled a cycle. But we cannot expect that of any but great men, and Uncle Peter was not a great man, though I think I shall be able to show that he was a good man. The only pieces of selfishness I ever discovered in him were his self-gratulation at having been born on Christmas Day, and the ambition with regard to his death, which I have just recorded. And that this selfishness was not of a kind to be very injurious to his fellow men, I think I shall be able to show as well. The first remembrance that I have of him is his taking me one Christmas Eve to the largest toy shop in London, and telling me to choose any toy whatever that I pleased. He little knew the agony of choice into which this request of his, for it was put to me as a request, in the most polite, loving manner, threw his astonished nephew. If a general right of choice from the treasures of the whole world had been unanimously voted me, it could hardly have cast me into a greater perplexity. I wandered about, staring like a distracted ghost at the wealth of Ormus and of Ind displayed about me. Uncle Peter followed me with perfect patience, nay, I believe with a delight that equalled my perplexity. For every now and then, when I looked round to him with a silent appeal for sympathy in the distressing dilemma into which he had thrown me, I found him rubbing his hands and spiritually chuckling over his victim. Nor would he volunteer the least assistance to save me from the dire consequences of too much liberty. How long I was in making up my mind, I cannot tell, but as I look back upon this splendor of my childhood, I feel as if I must have wandered for weeks through interminable forest alleys of toy-bearing trees. As often as I read the story of Aladdin, and I read it now and then still, for I have children about and their books about, the subterranean orchard of jewels always brings back to my inward vision the inexhaustible riches of the toy shop to which Uncle Peter took me that Christmas Eve. As soon as, in despair of choosing well, I had made a desperate plunge at decision, my Uncle Peter, as if to forestall any supervention of repentance, began buying like a maniac, giving me everything that took his fancy or mine, till we and our toys nearly filled the cab which he called to take us home. Uncle Peter was a little round man, not very fat, resembling both in limbs and features an overgrown baby. And I believe the resemblance was not merely an external one, for though his intellect was quite up to par, he retained a degree of simplicity of character and of tastes that was not childlike only, but bordered sometimes upon the childish. To look at him, you could not have fancied a face or a figure with less of the romantic about them. Yet I believe that the whole region of his brain was held in fee simple, whatever that may mean, by a race of fairy architects, who built aerial castles therein regardless of expense. His imagination was the most distinguishing feature of his character, and to hear him defend any of his extravagancies, it would appear that he considered himself especially privileged in that respect. "Ah, my dear," he would say to my mother, when she expostulated with him on making some present far beyond the small means he at that time possessed. "Ah, my dear, you see I was born on Christmas Day." Many a time he would come in from town, where he was a clerk in a merchant's office, with the water running out of his boots and his umbrella carefully tucked under his arm, and we would know very well that he had given the last coppers he had for his omnibus home to some beggar or crossing-sweeper, and had then been so delighted with the pleasure he had given that he forgot to make the best of it by putting up his umbrella. Home he would trudge, in his worn suit of black, with his steel watch-chain and bunch of ancestral seals swinging and ringing from his fob, and the rain running into his trousers pockets, to the great endangerment of the health of his cherished old silver watch, which never went wrong because it was put right every day by St. Paul's. He was quite poor then, as I have said. I do not think he had more than £100 a year, and he must have been 35. I suppose his employers showed their care for the morals of their clerks by never allowing them any margin to misspend. But Uncle Peter lived in constant hope and expectation of some unexampled good luck befalling him. For, said he, I was born on Christmas Day. He was never married. When people used to jest with him about being an old bachelor, he used to smile, for anything would make him smile. But I was a very little boy indeed when I began to observe that the smile on such occasions was mingled with sadness, and that Uncle Peter's face looked very much as if he were going to cry. But he never said anything on the subject, and not even my mother knew whether he had had any love story or not. I have often wondered whether his goodness might not come in part from his having lost someone very dear to him, and having his life on earth purified by the thoughts of her life in heaven. But I never found out. After his death, for he did die, though not on Christmas Day, I found a lock of hair folded in paper with a date on it. That was all, in a secret drawer of his old desk. The date was far earlier than my first recollections of him. I reverentially burnt it with fire. He lived in lodgings by himself not far from our house, and when not with us was pretty sure to be found seated in his easy-chair, for he was fond of his simple comforts, beside a good fire, reading by the light of one candle. He had his tea always as soon as he came home, and some buttered toast or a hot muffin, of which he was sure to make me eat 3/4 if I chanced to drop in upon him at the right hour, which, I am rather ashamed to say, I not unfrequently did. He dared not order another, as I soon discovered. Yet I fear that did not abate my appetite for what there was. You see, I was never so good as Uncle Peter. When he had finished his tea, he turned his chair to the fire and read, what do you think? Sensible travels and discoveries, or political economy, or popular geology? No. Fairy tales, as many as he could lay hold of, and when they failed him, romances or novels. Almost anything in this way would do that was not bad. I believe he had read every word of Richardson's novels, and most of Fielding's and Defoe's. But once I saw him throw a volume in the fire, which he had been fidgeting over for a while. I was just finishing a sum I had brought across to him to help me with. I looked up and saw the volume in the fire. The heat made it writhe open, and I saw the author's name, and that was Sterne. He had bought it at a bookstall as he came home. He sat a while, and then got up and took down his Bible, and began reading a chapter in the New Testament, as if for an antidote to the book he had destroyed. But Uncle Peter's luck came at last. At least he thought it did, when he received a lawyer's letter announcing the demise of a cousin of whom he had heard little for a great many years, although they had been warm friends while at school together. This cousin had been brought up to some trade in the wood line, had been a cooper or a carpenter, and had somehow or other got landed in India, and, though not in the company's service, had contrived in one way and another to amass what might be called a large fortune in any rank of life. I am afraid to mention the amount of it, lest it should throw discredit on my story. The whole of this fortune he left to Uncle Peter, for he had no nearer relation, and had always remembered him with affection. I happened to be seated beside my uncle when the lawyer's letter arrived. He was reading Peter Wilkins. He laid down the book with reluctance, thinking the envelope contained some advertisement of slaty coal for his kitchen fire, or cottony silk for his girls' dresses. Fancy my surprise when my little uncle jumped up on his chair, and thence on the table, upon which he commenced a sort of demoniac hornpipe. But that sober article of furniture declined giving its support to such proceedings for a single moment, and fell with an awful crash to the floor. My uncle was dancing amidst its ruins like Nero in blazing Rome, when he was reduced to an awful sense of impropriety by the entrance of his landlady. I was sitting in open-mouthed astonishment at my uncle's extravagance, when he suddenly dropped into his chair like a lark into its nest, leaving heaven silent. But silence did not reign long. "Well, Mr. Belper," began his landlady, in a tone as difficult of description as it is easy of conception, for her fists had already planted themselves in her own opposing sides. But to my astonishment, my uncle was not in the least awed, although I am sure, however much he tried to hide it, that I have often seen him tremble in his shoes at the distant roar of this tigress. But it is wonderful how much courage a pocketful of sovereigns will give. It is far better for rousing the pluck of a man than any number of bottles of wine in his head. What a brave thing a whole fortune must be, then. "Take that rickety old thing away," said my uncle. "Rickety, Mr. Belper! I'm astonished to hear a decent gentleman like you slander the very table as you've eaten off for the last— we won't be precise to a year, ma'am," interrupted my uncle. "And if you will have little scapegraces of nevvies into my house to break the furniture, why, them as breaks pays, Mr. Belper." "Very well. Of course I will pay for it. I broke it myself, ma'am. And if you don't get out of my room, I'll—" Uncle Peter jumped up once more and made for the heap of ruins in the middle of the floor. The landlady vanished in a moment, and my uncle threw himself again into his chair and absolutely roared with laughter. "Shan't we have rare fun, Charlie, my boy?" said he at last, and went off into another fit of laughter. "Why, uncle, what is the matter with you?" I managed to say in utter bewilderment. "Nothing but luck, Charlie. It's gone to my head. I'm not used to it, Charlie, that's all. I'll come all right by and by. Bless you, my boy." What do you think was the first thing my uncle did to relieve himself of the awful accession of power which had just befallen him? The following morning he gathered together every sixpence he had in the house, and went out of one grocer's shop into another, and out of one baker's shop into another, until he had changed the whole into threepenny pieces. Then he walked to town as usual to business. But one or two of his friends who were walking the same way, and followed behind him, could not think what Mr. Belper was about. Every crossing that he came to he made use of to cross to the other side. He crossed and recrossed the same street 20 times, they said. But at length they observed that, with a legerdemain worthy of a professor, he slipped something into every sweeper's hand as he passed him. It was one of the threepenny pieces. When he walked home in the evening he had nothing to give, and besides went through one of the wet experiences to which I have already alluded. To add to his discomfort, he found, when he got home, that his tobacco jar was quite empty, so that he was forced to put on his wet shoes again, for he never, to the end of his days, had more than one pair at a time, in order to come across to my mother to borrow sixpence. Before the legacy was paid to him, he went through a good many of the tortures which result from being a king and no king. The inward consciousness and the outward possibility did not in the least correspond. At length, after much manoeuvring with the lawyers, who seemed to sympathize with the departed cousin in this, that they too would prefer keeping the money till death parted them and it, he succeeded in getting 1,000 pounds of it on Christmas Eve. "Now," said Uncle Peter, in enormous capitals. That night a thundering knock came to our door. We were all sitting in our little dining-room, father, mother, and 7 children of us, talking about what we should do next day. The door opened, and in came the most grotesque figure you could imagine. It was 7 feet high at least, without any head, a mere walking tree-stump as far as shape went, only it looked soft. The little ones were terrified, but not the bigger ones of us, for from top to toe, if it had a toe, it was covered with toys of every conceivable description, fastened onto it somehow or other. It was a perfect treasure cave of Ali Baba turned inside out. We shrieked with delight. The figure stood perfectly still, and we gathered round it in a group to have a nearer view of the wonder. We then discovered that there were tickets on all the articles, which we supposed at first to record the price of each. But upon still closer examination, we discovered that every one of the tickets had one or other of our names upon it. This caused a fresh explosion of joy. Nor was it the children only that were thus remembered. A little box bore my mother's name. When she opened it, we saw a real gold watch and chain, and seals and dangles of every sort, of useful and useless kind, and my mother's initials were on the back of the watch. My father had a silver flute, and to the music of it we had such a dance. The strange figure, now considerably lighter, joining in it without uttering a word. During the dance, one of my sisters, a very sharp-eyed little puss, espied about halfway up the monster 2 bright eyes looking out of a shadowy depth of something like the skirts of a great coat. She peeped and peeped, and at length, with a perfect scream of exultation, cried out, "It's Uncle Peter! It's Uncle Peter!" The music ceased, the dance was forgotten. We flew upon him like a pack of hungry wolves. We tore him to the ground, despoiled him of coats and plaids and elevating sticks, and discovered the kernel of the beneficent monster in the person of real Uncle Peter. Which, after all, was the best present he could have brought us on Christmas Eve, for we had been very dull for want of him, and had been wondering why he did not come. But Uncle Peter had laid great plans for his birthday, and for the carrying out of them he took me into his confidence, I being now a lad of 15, and partaking sufficiently of my uncle's nature to enjoy at least the fun of his benevolence. He had been for some time perfecting his information about a few of the families in the neighbourhood, for he was a bit of a gossip, and did not turn his landlady out of the room when she came in with a whisper of news, in the manner in which he had turned her out when she came to expostulate about the table. But she knew her lodger well enough never to dare to bring him any scandal. From her he had learned that a certain artist in the neighbourhood was very poor. He made inquiry about him where he thought he could hear more, and finding that he was steady and hard-working, Uncle Peter never cared to inquire whether he had genius or not. It was enough to him that the poor fellow's pictures did not sell. Resolved that he should have a more pleasant Christmas than he expected. One other chief outlet for his brotherly love in the present instance was a dissenting minister and his wife, who had a large family of little children. They lived in the same street with himself. Uncle Peter was an unwavering adherent to the Church of England, but he would have felt himself a dissenter at once if he had excommunicated anyone by withdrawing his sympathies from him. He knew that this minister was a thoroughly good man, and he had even gone to hear him preach once or twice. He knew, too, that his congregation was not the more liberal to him that he was liberal to all men. So he resolved that he would act the part of one of the black angels that brought bread and meat to Elijah in the wilderness. Uncle Peter would never have pretended to rank higher than one of the foresaid ravens. A great part of the forenoon of Christmas Day was spent by my uncle and me in preparations. The presents he had planned were many, but I will only mention 2 or 3 of them in particular. For the minister and his family he got a small bottle with a large mouth. This he filled as full of new sovereigns as it would hold, labelled it outside "pickled mushrooms," "for doesn't it grow in the earth without any seed?" said he, and then wrapped it up like a grocer's parcel. For the artist he took a large shell from his chimney-piece, folded a 50-pound note in a bit of paper, which he tied up with a green ribbon, inserted the paper in the jaws of the shell so that the ends of the ribbon should hang out, folded it up in paper and sealed it, wrote outside, "Enquire within," enclosed the whole in a tin box, and directed it, "with Christmas Day's compliments." "For wasn't I born on Christmas Day?" concluded Uncle Peter for the 20th time that forenoon. Then there were a dozen or 2 of the best port he could get, for a lady who had just had a baby, and whose husband and his income he knew from business relations. Nor were the children forgotten. Every house in his street and ours in which he knew there were little ones had a parcel of toys and sweet things prepared for it. As soon as the afternoon grew dusky, we set out with as many as we could carry. A slight disguise secured me from discovery, my duty being to leave the parcels at the different houses. In the case of the more valuable of them, my duty was to ask for the master or mistress, and see the packet in safe hands. In this I was successful in every instance. It must have been a great relief to my uncle when the number of parcels was sufficiently diminished to restore to him the use of his hands, for to him they were as necessary for rubbing as a tail is to a dog for wagging, in both cases for electrical reasons, no doubt. He dropped several parcels in the vain attempt to hold them and perform the usual frictional movement notwithstanding. So he was compelled instead to go through a kind of solemn pace, which got more and more rapid as the parcels decreased in number, till it became at last, in its wild movements, something like a Highlander's sword dance. We had to go home several times for more, keeping the best till the last. When Uncle Peter saw me give the pickled mushrooms into the hands of the lady of the house, he uttered a kind of laugh, strangled into a crow, which startled the good lady, who was evidently rather alarmed already at the weight of the small parcel. For she said, with a scared look, "It's not gunpowder, is it?" "No," I said. "I think it's shot." "Shot!" said she, looking even more alarmed. "Don't you think you had better take it back again?" She held the parcel to me, and made as if she would shut the door. "Why, ma'am," I answered, "you would not have me taken up for stealing it." It was a foolish reply, but it answered the purpose, if not the question. She kept the parcel and shut the door. When I looked round, I saw my uncle going through a regular series of convolutions, corresponding exactly to the bodily contortions he must have executed at school every time he received a course of what they call palmies in Scotland. If, indeed, Uncle Peter was ever even suspected of improper behaviour at school. It consisted first of a dance, then a double-up, then another dance, then another double-up, and so on. "Some stupid hoax, I suppose," said the artist, as I put the parcel into his hands. He looked gloomy enough, poor fellow. "Don't be too sure of that, if you please, sir," said I, and vanished. Everything was a good joke to Uncle all that evening. "Charlie," said he, "I never had such a birthday in my life before. But, please God, now I've begun, this will not be the last of the sort. But you young rascal, if you split, why, I'll thrash the life out of you. No, I won't." Here my uncle assumed a dignified attitude, and concluded with mock solemnity. "No, I won't. I will cut you off with a shilling." This was a crescendo passage, ending in a howl, upon which he commenced once more an edition of the Highland fling, with impromptu variations. When all the parcels were delivered, we walked home together to my uncle's lodgings, where he gave me a glass of wine and a sovereign for my trouble. I believe I felt as rich as any of them. But now I must tell you the romance of my uncle's life. I do not mean the suspected, hidden romance, for that no one knew, except, indeed, a dead one knew all about it. It was a later romance, which, however, nearly cost him his life once. One Christmas Eve we had been occupied, as usual, with the presents of the following Christmas Day, and, will you believe it, in the same lodgings too, for my uncle was a thorough Tory in his hatred of change. Indeed, although 2 years had passed, and he had had the whole of his property at his disposal since the legal term of 1 year, he still continued to draw his salary of £100 of Messrs. Buff and Codgers. One Christmas Eve, I say, I was helping him to make up parcels, when, from a sudden impulse, I said to him, "How good you are, uncle!" "Ha, ha, ha!" laughed he. "That's the best joke of all. Good, my boy. Ha, ha, ha! Why, Charlie, you don't fancy I care one atom for all these people, do you? I do it all to please myself. It's the cheapest pleasure at the money, considering the quality, that I know. That is a joke. Good indeed. I am happy to say I was an old enough bird not to be caught with this metaphysical chaff. But my uncle's face grew suddenly very grave, even sad in its expression, and after a pause he resumed, but this time without any laughing. "Good, Charlie? Why, I'm no use to anybody." "You do me good anyhow, uncle," I answered. "If I'm not a better man for having you for an uncle, why, I shall be a great deal the worse, that's all." "Why, there it is," rejoined my uncle. "I don't know whether I do good or harm. But for you, Charlie, you're a good boy, and don't want any good done to you. It would break my heart, Charlie, if I thought you weren't a good boy." He always called me a boy after I was a grown man, but then I believe he always felt like a boy himself, and quite forgot that we were uncle and nephew. I was silent, and he resumed. "I wish I could be of real, unmistakable use to anyone, but I fear I am not good enough to have that honour done me." Next morning, that was Christmas Day, he went out for a walk alone, apparently oppressed with the thought with which the serious part of our conversation on the preceding evening had closed. Of course, nothing less than a 3-penny piece would do for a crossing-sweeper on Christmas Day, but one tiny little girl touched his heart so that the usual coin was doubled. Still, this did not relieve the heart of the giver sufficiently, for the child looked up in his face in a way, whatever the way was, that made his heart ache. So he gave her a shilling, but he felt no better after that. I am following his own account of feelings and circumstances. "This won't do," said Uncle Peter to himself. "What is your name?" said Uncle Peter to the little girl. "Little Christmas," she answered. "Little Christmas!" exclaimed Uncle Peter. "I see why that wouldn't do now. What do you mean?" "Little Christmas, sir, please, sir." "Who calls you that?" "Everybody, sir." "Why do they call you that?" "It's my name, sir." "What's your father's name?" "I ain't got none, sir." "But you know what his name was." "No, sir." "How did you get your name, then? It must be the same as your father's, you know." "Then I suppose my father was Christmas Day, sir, for I knows of none else. They always calls me Little Christmas." A little sister of mine, I see," said Uncle Peter to himself. "Well, who's your mother?" "My aunt, sir. She knows I'm out, sir." There was not the least impudence in the child's tone or manner in saying this. She looked up at him with her gypsy eye in the most confident manner. She had not struck him in the least as beautiful, but the longer he looked at her, the more he was pleased with her. "Is your aunt kind to you?" "She gives me my wittles." "Suppose you did not get any money all day. What would she say to you?" "Oh, she won't give me a hidin' to-day, sir, supposin' I gets no more. You've give me enough already, sir. Thank you, sir. I'll change it into halfpence." "She does beat you sometimes, then?" "Oh, my!" Here she rubbed her arms and elbows as if she ached all over at the thought, and these were the only parts she could reach to rub for the whole. "I will," said Uncle Peter to himself. "Do you think you were born on Christmas Day, little one?" "I think I was once, sir." "I shall teach the child to tell lies if I go on asking her questions in this way," thought my uncle. "Will you go home with me?" he said coaxingly. "Yes, sir, if you will tell me where to put my broom, for I must not go home without it, else aunt would wallop me." "I will buy you a new broom." "But aunt would wallop me all the same if I did not bring home the old one for a Christmas fire." "Never mind, I will take care of you. You may bring your broom if you like, though," he added, seeing a cloud come over the little face. "Thank you, sir," said the child, and shouldering her broom she trotted along behind him as he led the way home. But this would not do either. Before they had gone 12 paces he had the child in one hand, and before they had gone a second 12 he had the broom in the other. And so Uncle Peter walked home with his child and his broom. The latter he set down inside the door, and the former he led upstairs to his room. There he seated her on a chair by the fire, and ringing the bell asked the landlady to bring a basin of bread and milk. The woman cast a look of indignation and wrath at the poor little immortal. She might have been the impersonation of Christmas Day in the catacombs, as she sat with her feet wide apart and reaching halfway down the legs of the chair, and her black eyes staring from the midst of knotted tangles of hair that never felt brush or comb, or were defended from the wind by bonnet or hood. I dare say Uncle's poor apartment, with its cases of stuffed birds and its square piano that was used for a cupboard, seemed to her the most sumptuous of conceivable abodes. But she said nothing, only stared. When her bread and milk came, she ate it up without a word, and when she had finished it, sat still for a moment, as if pondering what it became her to do next. Then she rose, dropped a curtsy, and said, "Thank you, sir. Please, sir, where's my broom?" "Oh, but I want you to stop with me and be my little girl." "Please, sir, I would rather go to my crossing." The face of little Christmas lengthened visibly, and she was upon the point of crying. Uncle Peter saw that he had been too precipitate, and that he must woo the child before he could hope to win her. So he asked her for her address. But though she knew the way to her home perfectly, she could give only what seemed to him the most confused directions how to find it. No doubt to her they seemed as clear as day. Afraid of terrifying her by following her, the best way seemed to him to promise her a new frock on the morrow if she would come and fetch it. Her face brightened so at the sound of a new frock that my uncle had very little fear of the fault being hers if she did not come. "Will you know the way back, my dear?" "I always know my way, anywheres," answered she. So she was allowed to depart with her cherished broom. Uncle Peter took my mother into counsel upon the affair of the frock. She thought an old one of my sister's would do best. But my uncle had said a new frock, and a new one it must be. So next day my mother went with him to buy one, and was excessively amused with his entire ignorance of what was suitable for the child. However, the frock being purchased, he saw how absurd it would be to put a new frock over such garments as she must have below, and accordingly made my mother buy everything to clothe her completely. With these treasures he hastened home, and found poor little Christmas and her broom waiting for him outside the door, for the landlady would not let her in. This roused the wrath of my uncle to such a degree that, although he had borne wrongs innumerable and aggravated for a long period of years without complaint, he walked in and gave her notice that he would leave in a week. I think she expected he would forget all about it before the day arrived, but with his further designs for little Christmas, he was not likely to forget it. And I fear I have seldom enjoyed anything so much as the consternation of the woman, whom I heartily hated, when she saw a truck arrive to remove my uncle's few personal possessions from her inhospitable roof. I believe she took her revenge by giving her cronies to understand that she had turned my uncle away at a week's warning for bringing home improper companions to her respectable house. But to return to little Christmas. She fared all the better for the landlady's unkindness, for my mother took her home and washed her with her own soft hands from head to foot, and then put all the new clothes on her, and she looked charming. How my uncle would have managed, I can't think. He was delighted at the improvement in her appearance. I saw him turn round and wipe his eyes with his handkerchief. "Now, little Christmas, will you come and live with me?" said he. She pulled the same face, though not quite so long as before, and said, "I would rather go to my crossing, please, sir." My uncle heaved a sigh, and let her go. She shouldered her broom as if it had been the rifle of a giant, and trotted away to her work. But next day, and the next, and the next, she was not to be seen at her wonted corner. When a whole week had passed and she did not make her appearance, my uncle was in despair. "You see, Charlie," said he, "I am fated to be of no use to anybody, though I was born on Christmas Day." The very next day, however, being Sunday, my uncle found her as he went to church. She was sweeping a new crossing. She seemed to have found a lower deep still, for alas, all her new clothes were gone, and she was more tattered and wretched-looking than before. As soon as she saw my uncle, she burst into tears. "Look," she said, pulling up her little frock, and showing her thigh with a terrible bruise upon it. "She did it." A fresh burst of tears followed. "Where are your new clothes, little Christmas?" asked my uncle. "She sold them for gin, and then beat me awful. Please, sir, I couldn't help it." The child's tears were so bitter that my uncle, without thinking, said, "Never mind, dear, you shall have another frock." Her tears ceased, and her face brightened for a moment. But the weeping returned almost instantaneously with increased violence, and she sobbed out, "It's no use, sir. She'd only serve me the same, sir." "Will you come home and live with me, then?" "Yes, please." She flung her broom from her into the middle of the street, nearly throwing down a cab-horse, betwixt whose forelegs it tried to pass. Then, heedless of the oaths of the man, whom my uncle pacified with a shilling, put her hand in that of her friend, and trotted home with him. From that day till the day of his death, she never left him, of her own accord at least. My uncle had by this time got into lodgings with a woman of the right sort, who received the little stray lamb with open arms and open heart. Once more she was washed and clothed from head to foot, and from skin to frock. My uncle never allowed her to go out without him, or someone who was capable of protecting her. He did not think it at all necessary to supply the woman, who might not be her aunt after all, with gin unlimited for the privilege of rescuing little Christmas from her cruelty. So he felt that she was in great danger of being carried off, for the sake either of her earnings or her ransom. And in fact, some very suspicious-looking characters were several times observed prowling about in the neighbourhood. Uncle Peter, however, took what care he could to prevent any report of this reaching the ears of little Christmas, lest she should live in terror, and contented himself with watching her carefully. It was some time before my mother would consent to our playing with her freely and beyond her sight, for it was strange to hear the ugly words which would now and then break from her dear little innocent lips. But she was very easily cured of this, although, of course, some time must pass before she could be quite depended upon. She was a sweet-tempered, loving child, but the love seemed for some time to have no way of showing itself, so little had she been used to ways of love and tenderness. When we kissed her, she never returned the kiss, but only stared. Yet whatever we asked her to do, she would do as if her whole heart was in it, and I did not doubt it was. Now I know it was. After a few years, when Christmas began to be considered tolerably capable of taking care of herself, the vigilance of my uncle gradually relaxed a little. A month before her 13th birthday, as near as my uncle could guess, the girl disappeared. She had gone to the day school as usual, and was expected home in the afternoon, for my uncle would never part with her to go to a boarding school, and yet wished her to have the benefit of mingling with her fellows, and not being always tied to the buttonhole of an old bachelor. But she did not return at the usual hour. My uncle went to inquire about her. She had left the school with the rest. Night drew on. My uncle was in despair. He roamed the streets all night, spoke about his child to every policeman he met, went to the station house of the district and described her, had bills printed and offered £100 reward for her restoration. All was unavailing. The miscreants must have seen bills, but feared to repose confidence in the offer. Poor Uncle Peter drooped and grew thin. Before the month was out, his clothes were hanging about him like a sack. He could hardly swallow a mouthful, hardly even sit down to a meal. I believe he loved his little Christmas every whit as much as if she had been his own daughter. Perhaps more, for he could not help thinking of what she might have been if he had not rescued her, and he felt that God had given her to him as certainly as if she had been his own child, only that she had come in another way. He would get out of bed in the middle of the night, unable to sleep, and go wandering up and down the streets and into dreadful places sometimes, to try to find her. But fasting and watching could not go on long without bringing friends with them. Uncle Peter was seized with a fever, which grew and grew till his life was despaired of. He was very delirious at times, and then the strangest fancies had possession of his brain. Sometimes he seemed to see the horrid woman she called her aunt torturing the poor child. Sometimes it was old pagan Father Christmas, clothed in snow and ice, come to fetch his daughter. Sometimes it was his old landlady, shutting her out in the frost, or himself finding her afterwards, but frozen so hard to the ground that he could not move her to get her indoors. The doctors seemed doubtful, and gave as their opinion a decided shake of the head. Christmas Day arrived. In the afternoon, to the wonder of all about him, although he had been wandering a moment before, he suddenly said, "I was born on Christmas Day, you know. This is the first Christmas Day that didn't bring me good luck." Turning to me, he added, "Charlie, my boy, it's a good thing another besides me was born on Christmas Day, isn't it?" "Yes, dear uncle," said I, and it was all I could say. He lay quite quiet for a few minutes, when there came a gentle knock to the street door. "That's Chrissy!" he cried, starting up in bed, and stretching out his arms with trembling eagerness. "And me to say this Christmas Day would bring me no good!" He fell back on his pillow and burst into a flood of tears. I rushed down to the door and reached it before the servant. I stared. There stood a girl about the size of Chrissy, with an old battered bonnet on, and a ragged shawl. She was standing on the doorstep, trembling. I felt she was trembling, somehow, for I don't think I saw it. She had Chrissy's eyes, too, I thought, but the light was dim now, for the evening was coming on. All this passed through my mind in a moment, during which she stood silent. "What is it?" I said, in a tremor of expectation. "Charlie, don't you know me?" she said, and burst into tears. We were in each other's arms in a moment, for the first time. But Chrissy is my wife now. I led her upstairs in triumph and into my uncle's room. "I knew it was my lamb!" he cried, stretching out his arms, and trying to lift himself up, only he was too weak. Chrissy flew to his arms. She was very dirty, and her clothes had such a smell of poverty. But there she lay in my uncle's bosom, both of them sobbing for a long time. And when at last she withdrew, she tumbled down on the floor, and there she lay motionless. I was in a dreadful fright, but my mother came in at the moment, while I was trying to put some brandy within her cold lips, and got her into a warm bath and put her to bed. In the morning she was much better, though the doctor would not let her get up for a day or two. I think, however, that was partly for my uncle's sake. When at length she entered the room one morning, dressed in her own nice clothes, for there were plenty in the wardrobe in her room, my uncle stretched out his arms to her once more and said, "Ah, Chrissy, I thought I was going to have my own way and die on Christmas Day. But it would have been one too soon before I had found you, my darling." It was resolved that on the same evening Chrissy should tell my uncle her story. We went out for a walk together, and though she was not afraid to go, the least thing startled her. A voice behind her would make her turn pale and look hurriedly round. Then she would smile again, even before the colour had had time to come back to her cheeks, and say, "What a goose I am! But it is no wonder." I could see, too, that she looked down at her nice clothes now and then with satisfaction. She does not like me to say so, but she does not deny it either, for Chrissy can't tell a story even about her own feelings. My uncle had given us £5 each to spend, and that was jolly. We bought each other such a lot of things, besides some for other people. And then we came home and had dinner tête-à-tête in my uncle's dining-room, after which we went up to my uncle's room and sat over the fire in the twilight till his afternoon nap was over, and he was ready for his tea. This was ready for him by the time he awoke. Chrissy got up on the bed beside him. I got up at the foot of the bed, facing her, and we had the tea-tray and plenty of etceteras between us. "Oh, I am happy," said Chrissy, and began to cry. "So am I, my darling," rejoined Uncle Peter, and followed her example. "So am I," said I, "but I don't mean to cry about it." And then I did. We all had 1 cup of tea and some bread and butter in silence after this. But when Chrissy had poured out the 2nd cup for Uncle Peter, she began of her own accord to tell us her story. "It was very foggy when we came out of school that afternoon, as you may remember, dear uncle." "Indeed I do," answered Uncle Peter with a sigh. "I was coming along the way home with Bessie. You know Bessie, uncle. And we stopped to look in at a bookseller's window where the gas was lighted. It was full of Christmas things already. One of them I thought very pretty, and I was standing staring at it, when all at once I saw that a big drabby woman had poked herself in between Bessie and me. She was staring in at the window too. She was so nasty that I moved away a little from her, but I wanted to have one more look at the picture. The woman came close to me. I moved again. Again she pushed up to me. I looked in her face, for I was rather cross by this time. A horrid feeling, I cannot tell you what it was like, came over me as soon as I saw her. I know how it was now, but I did not know then why I was frightened. I think she saw I was frightened, for she instantly walked against me and shoved and hustled me round the corner. It was a corner shop, and before I knew I was in another street. It was dark and narrow. Just at the moment a man came from the opposite side and joined the woman. Then they caught hold of my hands, and before my fright would let me speak I was deep into the narrow lane, for they ran with me as fast as they could. Then I began to scream, but they said such horrid words that I was forced to hold my tongue, and in a minute more they had me inside a dreadful house, where the plaster was dropping away from the walls, and the skeleton ribs of the house were looking through. I was nearly dead with terror and disgust. I don't think it was a bit less dreadful to me from having dim recollections of having known such places well enough at one time of my life. I think that only made me the more frightened, because so the place seemed to have a claim upon me. What if I ought to be there after all, and these dreadful creatures were my father and mother? I thought they were going to beat me at once, when the woman, whom I suspected to be my aunt, began to take off my frock. I was dreadfully frightened, but I could not cry. However, it was only my clothes that they wanted. But I cannot tell you how frightful it was. They took almost everything I had on, and it was only when I began to scream in despair, "Sit still, Charlie, it's all over now," that they stopped, with a nod to each other, as much as to say, "We can get the rest afterwards." Then they put a filthy frock on me, brought me some dry bread to eat, locked the door, and left me. It was nearly dark now, there was no fire, and all my warm clothes were gone. Do sit still, Charlie. I was dreadfully cold. There was a wretched-looking bed in one corner, but I think I would have died of cold rather than get into it, and the air in the place was frightful. How long I sat there in the dark I don't know." "What did you do all the time?" said I. "There was only one thing to be done, Charlie. I think that is a foolish question to ask." "Well, what did you do, Chrissy?" "Said my prayers, Charlie." "And then?" "Said them again." "And nothing else?" "Yes, I tried to get out of the window, but that was of no use, for I could not open it, and it was 1 story high at least." "And what did you do next?" "Said over all my hymns." "And then?" "What did you do next?" "Why do you ask me so many times?" "Because I want to know." "Well, I will tell you. I left my prayers alone, and I began at the beginning, and I told God the whole story as if he had known nothing about it, from the very beginning when Uncle Peter found me on the crossing, down to the minute when I was talking there to him in the dark." "Ah, my dear," said my uncle with faltering voice, "you felt better after that, I dare say. And here was I in despair about you, and thought he did not care for any of us. I was very naughty indeed." "And what next?" I said. By and by I heard a noise of quarrelling in the street, which came nearer and nearer. The door was burst open by someone falling against it. Blundering steps came up the stairs. The 2 who had robbed me, evidently tipsy, were trying to unlock the door. At length they succeeded and tumbled into the room. "Where is the unnatural wretch," said the woman, "who ran away and left her own mother in poverty and sickness?" "Oh, uncle, can it be that she is my mother?" said Chrissy, interrupting herself. "I don't think she is," answered Uncle Peter. "She only wanted to vex you, my lamb. But it doesn't matter whether she is or not." "Doesn't it, uncle? I'm ashamed of her." "But you are God's child, and he can't be ashamed of you. For he gave you the mother you had, whoever she was, and never asked you which you would have. So you need not mind. We ought always to like best to be just what God has made us." "I am sure of that, uncle." Well, she began groping about to find me, for it was very dark. I sat quite still, except for trembling all over, till I felt her hands on me, when I jumped up and she fell on the floor. She began swearing dreadfully, but did not try to get up. I crept away to another corner. I heard the man snoring and the woman breathing loud. Then I felt my way to the door, but to my horror found the man lying across it on the floor so that I could not open it. Then I believe I cried for the first time. I was nearly frozen to death, and there was all the long night to bear yet. How I got through it I cannot tell. It did go away. Perhaps God destroyed some of it for me. But when the light began to come through the window and show me all the filth of the place, the man and the woman lying on the floor, the woman with her head cut and covered with blood, I began to feel that the darkness had been my friend. I felt this yet more when I saw the state of my own dress, which I had forgotten in the dark. I felt as if I had done some shameful thing, and wanted to follow the darkness and hide in the skirts of it. It was an old gown of some woolen stuff, but it was impossible to tell what, it was so dirty and worn. I was ashamed that even those drunken creatures should wake and see me in it. But the light would come, and it came and came until at last it waked them up, and the first words were so dreadful. They quarrelled and swore at each other and at me, until I almost thought there couldn't be a God who would let that go on so and never stop it. But I suppose he wants them to stop, and doesn't care to stop it himself, for he could easily do that, of course, if he liked. "Just right, my darling," said Uncle Peter with emotion. Chrissy saw that my uncle was too much excited by her story, although he tried not to show it, and with a wisdom which I have since learned to appreciate, cut it short. They did not treat me cruelly, though the worst was that they gave me next to nothing to eat. Perhaps they wanted to make me thin and wretched-looking, and I believe they succeeded. "Charlie, you'll turn over the cream if you don't sit still." 3 days passed this way. I have thought all over it, and I think they were a little puzzled how to get rid of me. They had no doubt watched me for a long time, and now they had got my clothes they were afraid. At last one night they took me out. My aunt, if aunt she is, was respectably dressed, that is, comparatively, and the man had a greatcoat on, which covered his dirty clothes. They helped me into a cart which stood at the door and drove off. I resolved to watch the way we went, but we took so many turnings through narrow streets before we came out in a main road, that I soon found it was all one mass of confusion in my head, and it was too dark to read any of the names of the streets, for the man kept as much in the middle of the road as possible. We drove some miles, I should think, before we stopped at the gate of a small house with a big porch, which stood alone. My aunt got out and went up to the house and was admitted. After a few minutes she returned, and making me get out, she led me up to the house, where an elderly lady stood, holding the door half open. When we reached it, my aunt gave me a sort of shove in, saying to the lady, "There she is." Then she said to me, "Come now, be a good girl and don't tell lies," and turning hastily ran down the steps and got into the cart at the gate, which drove off at once the way we had come. The lady looked at me from head to foot sternly, but kindly too, I thought, and so glad was I to find myself clear of those dreadful creatures that I burst out crying. She instantly began to read me a lecture on the privilege of being placed with Christian people, who would instruct me how my soul might be saved, and teach me to lead an honest and virtuous life. I tried to say that I had led an honest life, but as often as I opened my mouth to tell anything about myself or my uncle, or indeed to say anything at all, I was stopped by her saying, "Now don't tell lies. Whatever you do, don't tell lies." This shut me up quite. I could not speak when I knew she would not believe me. But I did not cry. I only felt my face get very hot, and somehow my backbone grew longer, though I felt my eyes fixed on the ground. "But," she went on, "you must change your dress. I will show you the way to your room, and you will find a print gown there which I hope you will keep clean, and above all things, don't tell lies." Here Chrissy burst out laughing, as if it was such fun to be accused of lying. But presently her eyes filled, and she made haste to go on. You may be sure I made haste to put on the nice clean frock, and to my delight found other clean things for me as well. I declare I felt like a princess for a whole day after, notwithstanding the occupation, for I soon found that I had been made over to Mrs. Sprinks as a servant of all work. I think she must have paid these people for the chance of reclaiming one whom they had represented as at least a great liar. Whether my wages were to be paid to them, or even what they were to be, I never heard. I made up my mind at once that the best thing would be to do the work without grumbling, and do it as well as I could, for that would be doing no harm to anyone, but the contrary, while it would give me the better chance of making my escape. But though I was determined to get away the first opportunity, and was miserable when I thought how anxious you would all be about me, yet I confess it was such a relief to be clean and in respectable company that I caught myself singing once or twice the very first day. But the old lady soon stopped that. She was about in the kitchen the greater part of the day till almost dinner-time, and taught me how to cook and save my soul both at once. "Indeed," interrupted Uncle Peter, "I have read receipts for the salvation of the soul that sounded very much as if they came out of a cookery book." And the wrinkles of his laugh went up into his nightcap. Neither Chrissy nor I understood this at the time, but I have often thought of it since. Chrissy went on. I had finished washing up my dinner things and sat down for a few minutes, for I was tired. I was staring into the fire, and thinking how I should get away, and what I should do when I got out of the house, and feeling as if the man and the woman were always prowling about it and watching me through the window, when suddenly I saw a little boy in the corner of the kitchen, staring at me with great brown eyes. He was a little boy, perhaps about 6 years old, with a pale face and very earnest look. I did not speak to him, but waited to see what he would do. A few minutes passed, and I forgot him. But as I was wiping my eyes, which would get wet sometimes, notwithstanding my good fortune, he came up to me, and said in a timid whisper, "Are you a princess?" "What makes you think that?" I said. "You have got such white hands," he answered. "No, I am not a princess," I said. "Aren't you Cinderella?" "No, my darling," I replied, "but something like her, for they have stolen me away from home and brought me here. I wish I could get away." And here I confess I burst into a downright fit of crying. "Don't cry," said the little fellow, stroking my cheek. "I will let you out some time. Shall you be able to find your way home all by yourself?" "Yes, I think so," I answered, but at the same time I felt very doubtful about it, because I always fancied those people watching me. But before either of us spoke again, in came Mrs. Sprinks. "You naughty boy! What business have you to make the servant neglect her work?" For I was still sitting by the fire, and my arm was round the dear little fellow, and his head was leaning on my shoulder. "She's not a servant, auntie," cried he indignantly. "She's a real princess, though of course she won't own to it." "What lies you have been telling the boy! You ought to be ashamed of yourself. Come along directly. Get the tea at once, Jane." My little friend went with his aunt, and I rose and got the tea. But I felt much lighter-hearted, since I had the sympathy of the little boy to comfort me. Only I was afraid they would make him hate me. But although I saw very little of him the rest of the time, I knew they had not succeeded in doing so, for as often as he could, he would come sliding up to me, saying, "How do you do, princess?" and then run away, afraid of being seen and scolded. I was getting very desperate about making my escape, for there was a high wall about the place, and the gate was always locked at night. When Christmas Eve came, I was nearly crazy with thinking that tomorrow was Uncle's birthday, and that I should not be with him. But that very night, after I had gone to my room, the door opened, and in came little Eddie in his nightgown, his eyes looking very bright and black over it. "There, princess," said he, "there is the key of the gate. Run!" I took him in my arms and kissed him, unable to speak. He struggled to get free and ran to the door. There he turned and said, "You will come back and see me some day, will you not?" "That I will," I answered. "That you shall," said Uncle Peter. I hid the key and went to bed, where I lay trembling. As soon as I was sure they must be asleep, I rose and dressed. I had no bonnet or shawl but those I had come in, and though they disgusted me, I thought it better to put them on. But I dared not unlock the street door for fear of making a noise. So I crept out of the kitchen window, and then I got out of the gate all right. No one was in sight, so I locked it again and threw the key over. But what a time of fear and wandering about I had in the darkness before I dared to ask anyone the way. It was a bright, clear night, and I walked very quietly till I came upon a great wide common. The sky and the stars and the wideness frightened me, and made me gasp at first. I felt as if I should fall away from everything into nothing, and it was so lonely. But then I thought of God, and in a moment I knew that what I had thought loneliness was really the presence of God. And then I grew brave again and walked on. When the morning dawned, I met a bricklayer going to his work, and found that I had been wandering away from London all the time. But I did not mind that. Now I turned my face towards it, though not the way I had come. But I soon got dreadfully tired and faint, and once I think I fainted quite. I went up to a house and asked for a piece of bread, and they gave it to me, and I felt much better after eating it. But I had to rest so often, and got so tired, and my feet got so sore that— You know how late it was before I got home to my darling uncle. "And me too," I expostulated. "And you too, Charlie," she answered, and we all cried over again. "This shan't happen any more," said my uncle. After tea was over, he asked for writing things and wrote a note, which he sent off. The next morning, about 11, as I was looking out of the window, I saw a carriage drive up and stop at our door. "What a pretty little brougham!" I cried. "And such a jolly horse! Look here, Chrissy." Presently Uncle Peter's bell rang, and Miss Chrissy was sent for. She came down again, radiant with pleasure. "What do you think, Charlie? That carriage is mine, all my own, and I am to go to school in it always. Do come and have a ride in it." You may be sure I was delighted to do so. "Where shall we go?" I said. "Let us ask Uncle if we may go and see the little darling who set me free." His consent was soon obtained, and away we went. It was a long drive, but we enjoyed it beyond everything. When we reached the house, we were shown into the drawing-room. There was Mrs. Sprinks and little Eddie. The lady stared, but the child knew Cinderella at once, and flew into her arms. "I knew you were a princess!" he cried. "There, auntie!" But Mrs. Sprinks had put on an injured look, and her hands shook very much. "Really, Miss Belper, if that is your name, you have behaved in a most unaccountable way. Why did you not tell me, instead of stealing the key of the gate and breaking the kitchen window? A most improper way for a young lady to behave, to run out of the house at midnight." "You forget, madam," replied Chrissy, with more dignity than I had ever seen her assume, "that as soon as ever I attempted to open my mouth, you told me not to tell lies. You believed the wicked people who brought me here rather than myself. However, as you will not be friendly, I think we had better go. Come, Charlie?" "Don't go, princess," pleaded little Eddie. "But I must, for your auntie does not like me," said Chrissy. "I am sure I always meant to do my duty by you, and I will do so still. Beware, my dear young woman, of the deceitfulness of riches. Your carriage won't save your soul." Chrissy was on the point of saying something rude, as she confessed when we got out, but she did not. She made her bow, turned, and walked away. I followed, and poor Eddie would have done so too, but was laid hold of by his aunt. I confess this was not quite proper behaviour on Chrissy's part, but I never discovered that till she made me see it. She was very sorry afterwards, and my uncle feared the brougham had begun to hurt her already, as she told me, for she had narrated the whole story to him, and his look first let her see that she had been wrong. My uncle went with her afterwards to see Mrs. Sprinks, and thank her for having done her best, and to take Eddie such presents as my uncle only knew how to buy for children. When he went to school, I know he sent him a gold watch. From that time till now that she is my wife, Chrissy has had no more such adventures. And if Uncle Peter did not die on Christmas Day, it did not matter much, for Christmas Day makes all the days of the year as sacred as itself. End of My Uncle Peter, by George MacDonald.